Hello, everyone. My name is Akito Van Troyer. I'm from MIT Media Lab, Cambridge, Boston, Massachusetts in the US. And I'm going to present today about the group projects. I myself and lots of people work in the group. As soon as my slide comes up, I'll kind of start introducing you. So I'm not sure how many of you guys know MIT Media Lab, but I'll keep it short about the Media Lab itself because there's so much to talk about it itself. But I'm from a group called Opera of the Future within the MIT Media Lab, and we focus on research in music, performance, composition, and how new technology can come into this space to enhance kind of a new way of experiencing performance and expressing performance and so forth. Can I get a next slide? So before our group was called Opera of the Future, our group was called Hyper Instruments. What people did back days was to augment traditional musical instrument like cello, piano, violin, and so forth with added sensors and so forth. Next slide, please. So here I'll kind of show you a video. Yo-Yo-Ma is playing cello, and if you see his hand, there's a lot of sensors attached to his hand. What we are doing is measuring his expressive quality of his performance. And when we capture those information from him, we translate it into electronic sounds that accompanies his cello performance. Could I get a next slide? So this is some of the most recent project. This hyper instrument concept comes alive. It's kind of the same concept where you have a sensor bowl. It's a commercially available bowl, which is called a K-bowl. It's a wireless cello bowl that you can measure a lot of expressive quality of performance, such as how tight you're gripping the bowl, what is the relationship of your bowl to the cello itself, and so forth. And then in this case, we apply to the lighting that's surrounding the cello player and so forth. Next slide. Yeah, so this is kind of some of the samples. You can not only use this to accompany with the sound for the performance, but you can accompany lightings and so forth. And can I get a next slide? So this hyper instrument concept comes into today's our research. We're Opera of the Future group, so obviously we do opera works. And then one of the most recent performance we've been doing is called The Death and the Powers. Next slide, please. The story of this opera is about this rich and powerful man you see in the center who wants to die, but he wants to leave everything about himself in this world. So before he dies, he downloads himself into his environment or computer system within his house. And I'll kind of show you the excerpt of how the opera actually looks like. Next slide.
Billions of bucks, and I can still sign checks.
This is basically the overview of how the opera went. As you saw, the opera is about robots, mostly. Everything you see on stage except the actors are robots. Next slide, please. And I'll kind of introduce you some of the robots that's in the opera itself. Here you see a chandelier that's opened up. And one of the scene, next slide, please. One of the actor comes up and then actually perform this chandelier, robotic chandelier. It's actually also a giant musical instrument. And the actor is performing by strumming the strings, and we capture that vibration and translate it into electronic sounds and so forth. Next slide, please. The giant ball you see with a LED display is actually also a robot. They move around the stage during the show to reconfigure themselves to form a new stage set. And they're fully autonomous robots. They're aware of where exactly they're placed on the stage, and then they move around according to that. Next slide, please. So this is some of the other scenes. Next slide. And another component of this opera is the tiny triangular robots. We've been calling them the opera butts, but they kind of act like a Greek chorus for the traditional opera. And next slide. If you see, we have like many of them actually, total 12 of them. And they are semi-autonomous. The lighting and the articulation of the robot is pre-programmed, while driving of them are actually controlled by puppeteers, human puppeteers. Next slide. Yeah, so here's a kind of example of puppeteer controlling the robot using Xbox controller, basically. So it's actually really fun to drive them around on stage. Next slide. So the reason why we did this performance is because of this research we've been doing called disembodied performance. How do you represent a character without him actually being present on stage? So as I said, this main character dies on first scene and literally never comes back on stage again. What we do behind the scene is to hook him up with lots of sensors. As you see on the chest, we're measuring the breath. Of course, we measure how he is singing and also hand gestures. Next slide, please. And we do some mapping works. From that captured sensor data, we do some analysis on it and then map it to, for example, the visual patterns you see on the giant display. But this could be also applied to the surround sound system we have within the opera house as well, and also the robotic movements and so forth. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is kind of to show you the computer system we use backstage. We have about 50 computers that talks to each other. And the whole point of having this computer system is to have that one character be able to control every single aspect of the performance, from lighting to sound to movements of robots and so forth. Next slide, please. And this Death in the Powers has been going on for about 4 years now. We premiered in Monaco about 3 years ago, and we mostly be performing in the United States, including Boston, Chicago, and Dallas. And this is Powers Live is the most recent addition to the Death in the Powers performance. Basically, we added a simulcast component to the existing performance for the Dallas Opera Theater. Next slide, please. And what this meant for us is to have remote audience member not necessarily being present at the Dallas Opera House, but participate in the show remotely. I think people participated from like San Francisco, Paris, and so forth. And you kind of see everybody's holding on a mobile device. We not just like had the simulcast component, but we also wanted to have remote audience member actually interacting with live performance that was happening in Dallas. Next slide, please. This is some of the screenshots from the mobile application we made for this opera work. Some of the scenes are represented with the abstract images, which people can use to interact directly with the opera house. Next slide. This is the entire system, how the simulcast system worked. As you can see, this one person controlling the entire system still exists within this simulcast systems we built and so forth. Next slide. So I will give you one of the example how remote audience members connected to the live performance. In this case, the Dallas Opera House had a large chandelier with a lot of lighting rods you see on the images. Next slide, please. And basically, in some of the scene, the remote audience member were able to control the lighting parameter of these giant chandelier when the performance was happening and so forth. Next slide, please. So all the works I've been showing so far was developed for professional musicians, but we also actually do research into people who not necessarily have musical background, but turn them into musicians. And some of the earliest work we've done in this area is called the brain opera. Well, what you see on the screen right now is all the different kind of musical instruments we created for the public to be able to easily perform music. I'll kind of show you the excerpt of how the performance itself looked like. Next slide, please.
Technologische Innovation und Computerbeherrschung.
Here they're showing the singing tree where you can sing in
Das Publikum der
display.
Brain Opera
And it kind of
drückt,
responds.
schlägt, quetscht oder aktiviert mit Gesten diese sogenannten Hyperinstrumente.
This is called a
Diese wiederum
gesture wall.
reagieren
You
auf
could
die
just
Benutzer
interact
und bringen
from
Klänge,
the
Melodien
wall to
oder Bilder
generate
hervor.
music. And this is called a banging tree where people just bang on the giant
Keine Maus
fruit.
und keine Tastatur sind dabei die Mittler zwischen Mensch und Maschine. Die Computer und die Datenbanken, die dahinter stecken, haben Augen und Ohren, erkennen mit Hilfe von Sensortechniken die Benutzer.
Yeah, next slide, please.
Das renommierte
And above all, the audience members participated in the show. The people who liked the brain opera the most was kids, actually. They were most engaged in this interaction. And we basically said, oh, kids can be very engaged in a musical activity, so we want to do more something with kids. Next slide, please. So we move on to the next project called Toy Symphony, which is a project about connecting kids and symphony to perform a music together and also compose the music together. This is some of the scenes taken from the Toy Symphony. Next slide. The first thing we did was to create a lot of musical instruments. Could I get a next slide? This is some of the musical instruments we specifically built for this project. One on the right is called a squeezable. You could just squeeze the ball to make music. So basically anybody can make music that way. One on the left is called a beat bug, where you can program a beat pattern by tapping on the machine and then also controlling the antenna to change the beat you just created. And these both musical instruments were collaborative musical instruments. Oh, I think, next slide, please. I could probably show you some of the
First clapping activity before
way
the
people
workshop.
use this.
I just saw him clap.
A little bit and only then conducting.
So using the antenna to control the pitch. You could also share the musical patterns between the buds. Next slide, please. This is kind of a digression, but I wanted to introduce my own work I've been working on that kind of extends the Toy Symphony idea of creating musical instruments that anybody can play. This one is called the drum top. It's a tabletop drum machine that turns everyday objects into a percussive musical instrument. So you kind of see an example of cups and plates and so forth on the interface. If you go to next slide, please. You see how this machine works. So interface is quite simple. You can program a drum pattern and also change tempo of the machine. But from there, as long as you kind of find something interesting around you to play with, you can keep making beats with it. In this example, I have a lot of them prefabricated myself, but of course you can use things like cups, water bottle, and things like that to create interesting musical instrument. Next slide, please. And for going back to Toy Symphony idea, we not only created musical instrument for kids to be able to perform music, we also created a composition environment any kids can use to compose a symphony work. This software is called Hyperscore. It's now a commercially available software, but kids can compose music with this just by drawing a squiggly line, as you see on the screen. The first stage is kind of like a building a tiny melodic fragments that you see on the top side of the display, and the bottom very long one is where you actually compose music using those melodic motifs and so forth. Next slide, please. I'll kind of show you some of the way the software works.
We really need to, I don't know what you're doing with this, but we need to figure out.
Basically, this software became the main driven source for this Toy Symphony project because once kids compose music with it, you can actually print out a music sheet, which then you can hand to a professional musician. In this case, we did it with an orchestra and have them perform the kids' composition with actual live musical instruments and so forth. Next slide, please. Moving forward to one of the most recent projects we've been doing is called City Symphonies. The project is about massive musical collaboration. A lot of them go into pre-concert activities, how to engage audience members before they actually go to the concert, and then try to make them creative in terms of collecting musical materials and sharing those musical materials with a composer and so forth. Next slide, please. So one of the ways we engage people in this process is by giving a workshop, by going to a particular cities. In the previous slide, I show a place in Toronto, Edinburgh, and Perth in Australia. Those are all the places we've done this project so far. But what we typically do is to take a software like Hyperscore and give a workshop in that city, primarily trying to engage kids in composing music. And we also give workshop about recording sounds in the city, try to have them record sounds that they think this represents that city in particular, and so forth. Next slide, please. Inspired by Hyperscore kind of software, we've been developing a lot of web-based composition environments, such as this one, and next slides. And City Soaring, and next slide, please. I will show you some of the scoring software I've been working on. This one is called a constellation. All the dots you see on the screen contains a fragment of sound, and the user can just explore the sound within this environment, just clicking and dragging the mouse and so forth. You can reconfigure the patterns of dots so you can explore the sound in different ways. And this is basically how you compose the music, just by drawing a line on the screen. So yeah, we've been kind of like looking out through ways to engage people in creating music with a very simple and intuitive musical interface. And on top of that, this runs on a web browser. That means anybody from the world can access this and try to be creative with creating music and so forth. This example is called a cauldron. It's basically mixing pots where you get to kind of like dissolve a ingredient within the pots. But the idea is very similar. Kind of the first stage is about exploring the sound that's hidden in the environment. And from there, with a steering motion, you can create your musical composition and so forth. This one, it's called the water, is the most still in work in progress, but kind of a metaphoric way of thinking how the next generation of score making might work. And this one is based on water. All the sounds you hear are water, and then the visual representation is trying to capture that water quality as well. Next slide, please. And then another aspect of this City Symphony project is a project called Repertoire Remix. It's about engaging audience members into performance in real time. In this case, most people participated in remotely into the performance. Next slide, please. So this will kind of show you the excerpt of how this performance worked. Probably need to press forward again. Next slide.
You'll see on the interface a selection of pieces. These are all among the most performed pieces at the Edinburgh Festival. The idea is to indicate with your mouse movements which composer at which moment you would like to hear more of. Tay will be reading all of your instructions through this interface, and that will be guiding his improvisation. And I'll be using this material to make the mix of repertoire music that actually goes in the final Festival City composition.
So here the pianist is reading remote audience members' preferences, what kind of music they wanted to actually hear, and then pianist is improvising based on the inputs he gets from the remote audience member. Next slide, please. This experiment has been going on, and the most recent, which I didn't really have time to document for this presentation today, but you kind of see the interface we kind of coming up with, which is more cloud-based and very abstract way of representing what the audience member wants pianists to actually play. Next screen, please. And this version actually works in conjunction with live performance that's happening on site. The audience member, just like you guys, takes out mobile device and then basically give preferences with their mobile device. And according to that, the graphic changes, and this is basically a real-time scoring for the pianist to be able to improvise what's coming next, and so forth. Next slide, please. And the most recent collaborators we have is Lucerne in Switzerland. We've been working really hard on making next generation of how to engage audience members into musical creativity and try to have them collect more musical materials such as sound recordings and so forth. What we've been doing is, next slide please, is to create this new environment which is locative sound sharing environment. Basically created a mobile device you kind of see on the right side where people can just go out in the city and then record music and then upload it to our web server. And if you go to our website, you can see all the sounds that people have recorded and uploaded to our environment. And this is kind of a way to map the city from the sound perspective. And we're hoping to use this environment further to make it into a new composition environment that's based on the location and so forth. Next slide, please. So that's basically City Symphony. I'm moving on to a very different project, which is called Vocal Vibration. This one is purely a installation work, and it's probably the most recent projects we've been working on. The project itself is about the vocal, trying to have people sing in the installation so that we could try to raise their awareness through singing and so forth. The part you see right now is one of the sections of the installation where people get to sit down in this environment and hear a music composition composed by advisor Todd Macover and basically experience this environment. And next slide, please. But there's another component to this installation where people get to have their own private experience. It's called a cocoon. And this is kind of the entrance what you see when you enter this area. Next slide, please. In this private experience, what people do is to wear a headphone and basically shut down all your speaking voice and hold this object called orb in their hand and basically sing along with music they hear through the headphone. And what we're trying to do here is to, it's kind of hard to see it, but we are also capturing the voice of the participant and then translating that into a tactile sensation on their hand. So they can experience their voice not just with their ear, but also with their tactile sensation. So that in the hope that we can make them realize how unique their voice is and so forth. Next slide, please. This is the orb. It sounds like this is gonna go commercial product, and we've been working really hard to develop this so that people can have this and have new kind of a meditation experience at home through singing and so forth. Next slide. What we've been doing also with this project is to really capture what's going through people's mind when they have their individual experience. So on this lady's face, we attached a number of contact microphone and then measure the vibration within her face. And what kind of pitch actually vibrates different parts of the face. And then also we measured galvanic skin response through your palm so that we can measure this person's emotional states, the arousal state and the relaxed state. So in the center, you kind of see the waveform. The higher the waveform is, this person's being very engaged in this performance and so forth. Next slide, please. Basically, this is up to here. I've been showing a lot of musical projects and so forth, but we also do theater works as well. And one of the most recent one we've done is called Sleep No More. And the subtitle for it is Remote Theatrical Immersion. The performance itself is about site-specific theatrical performance in which the performance takes place in a 5-story high building with 100 rooms converted into a theater space. And there's simultaneous performance happening on all different floors. And you as an audience, next slide please, you wear a mask. As you see on this, it's kind of dark and hard to see it on the background, but you wear a mask and then you basically wander around the building. So it's really not traditional kind of performance. You decide to follow a character. The story itself is based on the Macbeth from the Shakespeare and so forth. The problem with this performance is that you have to physically go to this performance space to be able to experience this amazing performance. But this work itself is produced by a company called Punch Drunk. Punch Drunk people came to us, Opera of the Future, and then discussed, can we extend the experience beyond this performance space? So what we did basically is to create a remote experience for the remote audience members. Next slide, please. So that the remote audience members can be paired with the on-site audience member to explore the performance space and then discover the story behind the performance and so forth. Next slide, please. So this is kind of like the interface that the remote audience members were seeing during the performance over the course of 3 hours. It's maybe some of you guys played a game, text adventure games, where you get to type in anything. And that's basically the metaphor we went for, because in the actual real performance, what people do is exploring the space on their own and on their own will, basically. So yeah, next slide, please. This is kind of like some of the interface that remote audience members were going through. Next slide. And we also built a new technology for the on-site audience members so that they can be connected to the remote audience member to explore the space together. In this case, what you see is a mask with embedded wearable technology inside. So inside a mask, we put a lot of sensors to capture their experience, what kind of experience they're going through, because they're not allowed to talk during the performance. So we wanted to capture implicit experience they're having within the performance space. So the sensor example would be a biological one, like heart rate, and also the skin response to measure the emotional state. We also capture the environment, what kind of state they're in, like are they in the very bright place or dark place, and so forth. And we also try to do indoor location tracking, so we know exactly where in the building this person is, so that we can connect according to that with our remote audience members to try to discover the performance and so forth. Next slide, please. Another way we kind of try to have this two-way communication with our remote audience member is through this portal objects. This is an example of a typewriter that types by itself, but it was actually being controlled by the remote audience members trying to communicate with an on-site person right here to kind of decode the message to unlock the next level of performance and so forth. These portal objects existed in various places, including we augmented mirror, a dusty mirror, where remote audience members can draw or write a text to communicate with on-site members and so forth. Next slide, please. So this is kind of like a conceptual video we came up with for the performance. Oh, I don't know why it finished, but that was basically my last slide. Yeah, do you think you can go back to the last slide and try to play it again? Oh yeah, I don't know, there's something wrong with the video, I guess. Yeah, I'm sorry about that, but thank you so much for listening to my talk. And please feel free to ask questions if you have anything and so forth. Oh, wait, people are raising hands.
In here, sorry.
Yes.
Hi, we have seen all these kind of projects that the connection between persons, the production of music, and all the technology. And I have to ask you about why do you make these projects with the statement of a connection with people and technology and music?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and one of the way I can answer that question is that we strongly feel that music is people, where when you are experiencing music, you're music basically reminds who you are. Music connects us with the different people and so forth, and with technology we have today can, I think, further enhance that experience, and then music is a really, really great abstract language, kind of like goes beyond the actual spoken language and so forth, and people can communicate kind of in the abstract level, and then this is like kind of really interesting for us, try to connect people using new technologies and so forth. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's...
Another very simple, why do you select these classical musicians and also opera? In some of your...
Can you repeat that again? Like why we are doing this with classical musicians and also like the public audience members? Is that what your question is?
Yeah, so like that.
Yeah, so first of all, the reason why we work with the orchestra a lot, it has to do with my advisor, Todd McOver. He's a composer himself, and he's always looking for ways to compose music in different ways, and oftentimes is using new technology. If we go back really, really early slides, when we started the hyper instruments, it was about basically how can we like make a new experience out of traditional like symphony works and so forth, and then augmenting the musical instrument itself was a really, really great start, but we started to realize that that's not the only way we can engage people into a new musical works. So we've been, fortunately, we have things like mobile devices, like people carry around all the time, and then why not use those kind of new technology to try to have new kind of experience on top of existing, for example, symphony orchestra work and so forth.
Hello.
Hello.
Those instruments you were showing, some of them, do you have them here?
Unfortunately, I didn't have the time to prepare things. I did plan to bring my own drum top because people seem to get what the instrument is about when the actual instrument is in front of you. And unfortunately not, but all the digital ones you can access through internet because they live on the web server we built. And if you do like to kind of experience the musical composition environment we've been creating, I can actually direct you to the website so you can kind of experience and so forth.
Okay. Can I later look at your drum top or?
Yeah, I could try to talk about it more, but I don't have the actual musical instrument with me. So.
Oh, I thought you did, but
yeah.
Okay.
But maybe I'll give you the URL for the City Symphony project, in particular that we've been working with Lucerne. If you go to website symphonyforlucerne.ch, you find lots of musical composition environment we've been creating. It's also a accumulated website. We have a lot of blog posts about the project updates and so forth. So it's a really good place to find out some of the latest works we've been working on from the digital side.
I'm sorry, Symphony for the what?
Symphony for Lucerne. Lucerne is spelled Lucerne. .ch.
What's .ch?
It's I think extension for Switzerland. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
With these new ways to interact between the audience and the stage, on the stage members, have you seen any more participation in the public that is not, that doesn't go to classical music presentations?
Yeah, so our group kind of focuses on like symphony works and so forth, but there are actually a lot of work that happens outside of symphony context. The really good example of this is a dance club, for example. Dance club in itself is really technology-friendly environment. You know, a lot of the new technology people build comes right into that kind of a venue, and you know, internet and mobile devices, no exception. Some of the examples I've seen is the intercommunication with a DJ and the people who's dancing, kind of dancing people requesting what kind of music that they want to hear, and then that request goes to DJ. DJ has the opportunity to look at that. He doesn't have to play it that way, but you know, this is another way the communication is happening in a dance club context. And yeah, I think this intercommunication between the performer and audience definitely can happen, I think, in any kind of a performance in general.
Thank you.
Excuse me.
Yes.
You think that this new instrument that you are developing on algorithms and samples could be some kind of threat for the classical instrument?
It's a good question. I think for me, hyper instrument is kind of like the beginning of like a trend that has started. I think if you look at from today's perspective, everyone is kind of doing it, augmenting existing musical instrument kind of idea, whether that's including a robotic component to a guitar, for example, so that you can automate some of the performance and stuff like that. But it really started from the lab or the group we have, and then we've been kind of trying to extend this kind of idea, not just with augmenting it, but perhaps like interconnecting different musical instruments so that you can have like a different kind of playing experience and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
The programs you're developing for kids are just amazing. And my question is, are there any plans to implement these programs in public schools or schools generally?
Yeah, so the really, really good example of this is the HyperScore software we have, which is already commercial software to begin with. But it's been really, really helpful for us in giving a workshop in different cities, for example. And this is kind of the way to facilitate people's creativity, basically for people not necessarily having music backgrounds. And, you know, right away make them do something with the music, and then if they want to refine their music, they can spend as much as time they want. But it's basically for us, it's a gateway for breaking that boundary. You know, don't feel shy about playing music and so forth, but you know, just try and then see, you know, if you like it or not. And I think once people get used to this kind of environment, they can move on to, you know, much more sophisticated software, like, you know, well, GarageBand is not a good example, but, you know, like a Pro Tools or something like that. It's definitely has that kind of connotation that connects to more higher level music making environments and so forth. So I guess another aspect of that, the reason why we kind of moving into a web domain for making music and so forth is because of this accessibility type of thing. We don't want to limit the experience to, you know, a particular city or school and so forth. We want everybody to kind of experience what music is about, what feels like to make music and so forth. And, you know, using internet is definitely one way to go about this. And fortunately, these days, like web browser is getting really, really powerful. You can do a lot of audio processing, visual refinement, and so forth. And it's really becoming really, great environment for making musical composition environments and so forth as well. I guess there's no other questions. Yes. For the entire projects I've been showing you, yeah. So the main objective, it's actually kind of shifting throughout. Our group has been existing for approximately 25 years. First half of the group was focused on more about how do you express yourself musically. So earlier example I showed you really focused on augmenting existing musical instruments for professional musicians, and also making simple enough musical instrument for anybody to be able to play music. But now our focus is slightly changing to experience that people have with music. So some of the later things I've shown is, in particular, Vocal Vibration project and Sleep No More project really focuses on what kind of mental state they go through in the performance or installation and so forth, and how can we enhance the experience so that they have more immersive type of experience, and then internalize those experiences and make it more personal for themselves and so forth. So yeah, I would say the main point kind of is like from expression to experience is kind of how I see it. The group is kind of moving forward with what's the main theme of all the projects we've been working on and so forth. Is there any other questions? I think if there's no question, I think I will be done with this. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I'm really happy to be here. And after this, perhaps meeting you guys and so forth. And thank you so much.